The scorching August sun of 1873 beat down mercilessly on the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory, where the thunder of hoofbeats echoed across the barren landscape like the drums of war. Thomas Whitfield pressed his hand against the crimson stain spreading across his shirt, his weathered face contorted in agony as his horse stumbled beneath him. The bullet had torn through his shoulder with devastating force, sending waves of excruciating pain through his entire body. Behind him, the acrid smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, mixing with the metallic taste of blood that filled his mouth. The ambush had come without warning, just as Thomas was returning from checking his cattle near the disputed border that had become a battleground between two of the most powerful families in the territory. His vision blurred as he fought to stay conscious, knowing that one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. The Whitfield Ranch stretched for thousands of acres across the Wyoming wilderness, a testament to 3 generations of blood, sweat, and determination. Thomas had inherited not just the land, but also a bitter feud that had been raging for over 2 decades with the neighboring Harrington family. What had started as a simple boundary dispute had escalated into something far more sinister, with cattle rustling, property destruction, and now attempted murder poisoning the relationship between the 2 clans. As Thomas managed to guide his wounded horse toward the safety of his homestead, his mind raced with questions that demanded answers. Who had pulled that trigger from behind the rocky outcropping near Devil's Canyon? The shot had been precise, calculated, aimed to kill, rather than merely wound. Only someone with intimate knowledge of his daily routines could have known exactly where he would be at that moment. The Whitfield ranch house came into view through the haze of pain and exhaustion, its weathered wooden walls and stone chimney representing sanctuary in a world that had suddenly become far more dangerous. Thomas could see his ranch hands rushing toward him, their faces filled with alarm as they witnessed their boss barely clinging to life. Among them was Jake Patterson, his most trusted foreman, a man who had worked the Whitfield land for 15 years and had become more like family than an employee. The bullet wound throbbed with each heartbeat, sending fresh waves of agony through Thomas's body as willing hands helped him down from his horse. Blood continued to seep through his fingers despite his attempts to stem the flow, staining the dusty ground beneath his boots. The realization that someone had actually tried to murder him sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. Jake's weathered face was grim as he examined the wound, his experienced eyes taking in the severity of the situation. In a territory where the nearest doctor was a 2-day ride away, treating gunshot wounds had become an unfortunate necessity for anyone who chose to make their living on the frontier. The older man's hands were steady as he began to clean and bandage the injury, but Thomas could see the worry etched deep in the lines around his eyes. News of the shooting spread through the ranch like wildfire, reaching every corner of the property within hours. The ranch hands gathered in small groups, their voices hushed as they discussed the implications of what had happened. Everyone knew that the conflict with the Harrington family had been escalating, but an actual attempt on Thomas's life represented a dangerous new level of violence that could spiral completely out of control. As darkness began to fall across the Wyoming landscape, Thomas lay in his bed fighting waves of fever and pain, his mind consumed with thoughts of revenge. The Harrington name kept echoing through his consciousness, each repetition stoking the fires of hatred that had been burning in his heart for decades. Whoever had tried to kill him would pay the ultimate price, but first, he needed to identify the shooter and gather the evidence necessary to ensure justice would be served. The wound would heal, Thomas knew, but the scar it would leave behind would serve as a permanent reminder of the day someone tried to end his life. In the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier, where survival depended on strength and determination, showing weakness could invite further attacks. The shooter had made a critical mistake by allowing Thomas to live, and that error in judgment would ultimately lead to their downfall. 3 weeks after the shooting, Thomas Whitfield sat in his study examining the maps that covered his desk, his shoulder still aching from the bullet wound that had nearly cost him his life. The bandages had been removed, but the scar remained as a constant reminder of how close he had come to death. His investigation into the identity of his would-be assassin had led him down a path he never expected, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his enemies. The Harrington Ranch lay 15 miles to the east, separated from Whitfield property by a stretch of disputed land that had been the source of their conflict for over 20 years. Samuel Harrington had built his empire through what many considered ruthless tactics, acquiring smaller ranches through foreclosure and intimidation. The bad blood between the families had its roots in a business deal gone wrong, when Samuel had allegedly cheated Thomas's father out of prime grazing land through forged documents and bribed officials. What Thomas had discovered during his careful investigation surprised him more than the bullet that had torn through his flesh. Multiple witnesses had come forward with information that pointed away from the Harrington Ranch as the source of the attack. Instead, the evidence suggested that the shooter might have been someone much closer to home, someone with access to information about Thomas's daily routines and movements. The revelation that his attacker might not be a Harrington had shaken Thomas to his core, forcing him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the people around him. Trust had always been a precious commodity on the frontier, where a man's word was often the only thing standing between order and chaos. The possibility that someone in his inner circle had betrayed him represented a violation that cut deeper than any physical wound. Jake Patterson had been conducting his own quiet investigation among the ranch hands, carefully questioning each man about their whereabouts on the day of the shooting. The foreman's loyalty to Thomas was absolute, but even he seemed troubled by what they were uncovering. Several of the newer hands had backgrounds that didn't quite add up, and there were whispers about gambling debts and secret meetings that had taken place away from the ranch. As Thomas pondered these disturbing developments, a knock at his study door interrupted his thoughts. Jake entered with a grim expression, carrying news that would change the direction of their investigation entirely. A stranger had been asking questions in town about Thomas's routines, someone who claimed to be looking for work, but seemed more interested in gathering information than finding employment. The description Jake provided matched no one from the Harrington Ranch, but it did correspond to a man who had been seen near Devil's Canyon on several occasions leading up to the shooting. This mysterious figure appeared to be working alone, which raised even more questions about his motives and who might be paying him for his services. Professional gunmen were not uncommon in the territory, but they usually worked for someone with deep pockets and serious grievances. Thomas's mind raced as he considered the implications of this new information. If the shooter was indeed a hired gun, then someone with significant resources had wanted him dead badly enough to pay for professional services. The list of people who had both the means and the motive to arrange his murder was surprisingly short, and most of them were much closer to home than he had ever imagined. The thought that someone in his own community, perhaps even someone he considered a friend, had orchestrated the attempt on his life filled Thomas with a rage that burned hotter than the desert sun. Betrayal from an enemy was one thing, but treachery from within his own circle represented a violation of the unwritten codes that governed life on the frontier. Such betrayal demanded not just punishment, but complete and utter destruction of the perpetrator. As the investigation continued, Thomas found himself questioning everyone around him, searching for signs of deception in familiar faces. The paranoia was eating away at him like acid, destroying relationships that had taken years to build. Yet he knew that until the truth was revealed, he could trust no one completely, not even those who had stood by his side through years of hardship and struggle. The revelation about the hired gunman had also forced Thomas to reconsider his assumptions about the Harrington family. While Samuel Harrington was certainly capable of violence, the old rancher had always been direct in his confrontations. Hiring an assassin seemed too subtle for a man who preferred to settle his disputes with his fists or in face-to-face gunfights at high noon. The autumn of 1873 brought cooler temperatures to the Wyoming Territory, but the investigation into Thomas Whitfield's shooting had grown colder than the mountain air. 4 months had passed since the attack, and despite their best efforts, Thomas and Jake had been unable to identify the mysterious gunman or discover who had hired him. The frustration was eating away at Thomas like a slow poison, affecting his sleep, his appetite, and his ability to focus on the daily operations of his ranch. It was during this period of uncertainty and suspicion that fate intervened in the most unexpected way possible. Thomas had ridden into the town of Millbrook to conduct business with the bank and purchase supplies for the coming winter. The small frontier settlement served as a neutral meeting ground for ranchers from across the territory, including members of families who were otherwise sworn enemies. As Thomas emerged from the general store, his arms loaded with packages, he collided with a young woman who was hurrying down the wooden sidewalk. The impact sent both of them stumbling, and packages scattered across the dusty street. For a moment, Thomas found himself looking into the most striking pair of green eyes he had ever seen, framed by auburn hair that caught the afternoon sunlight like spun copper. The woman was clearly embarrassed by the collision, her cheeks flushing red as she bent to help gather the scattered goods. Her dress was well made but practical, the kind worn by someone who understood the demands of frontier life, but had been raised with certain refinements. There was something familiar about her features, but Thomas couldn't immediately place where he might have seen her before. As they worked together to collect the scattered items, Thomas found himself engaged in conversation with the mysterious woman. Her name was Catherine, she told him, and she was visiting Millbrook with her father on business related to their ranch. Her voice carried a slight accent that suggested Eastern education, but her hands showed the calluses of someone who was no stranger to hard work. The conversation continued as they stood on the sidewalk, and Thomas discovered that Catherine possessed both intelligence and wit that matched her striking beauty. She spoke knowledgeably about ranching operations, market prices for cattle, and the challenges of frontier life. Her insights were those of someone who had been raised in the business, not merely someone who had observed it from a distance. It wasn't until Catherine mentioned her father's name that Thomas felt as though he had been struck by lightning for the second time in 4 months. Samuel Harrington's daughter was standing before him, engaging in pleasant conversation as though the two families hadn't been engaged in a bitter feud for over 2 decades. The realization sent a shock through his system that had nothing to do with physical attraction. Catherine seemed to sense the change in Thomas's demeanor, and her own expression grew guarded as she recognized him in return. The daughter of Samuel Harrington was looking into the eyes of Thomas Whitfield, the man her father had taught her to consider their family's greatest enemy. Yet neither of them immediately retreated from the encounter, perhaps driven by curiosity about the person behind the family name. The conversation that followed was charged with tension and unspoken questions. Catherine had heard stories about Thomas Whitfield throughout her life, tales that painted him as a ruthless competitor who would stop at nothing to destroy the Harrington family. Yet the man standing before her bore little resemblance to the monster from her father's stories. Instead, she saw someone who appeared thoughtful, courteous, and surprisingly vulnerable beneath his rugged exterior. For Thomas, meeting Catherine represented a humanization of the enemy that had consumed his thoughts for decades. She was not the spoiled princess he had imagined, but rather a strong, independent woman who had clearly inherited her father's business acumen while maintaining a compassion that seemed foreign to the Harrington name. The discovery that Samuel Harrington had raised such a remarkable daughter forced Thomas to question some of his long-held assumptions about his enemies. The encounter lasted only 20 minutes, but it left both Thomas and Catherine with thoughts that would haunt them for weeks to come. Each had discovered that their family's enemy was more complex and human than they had ever imagined. The realization created a crack in the foundation of hatred that had defined their families for an entire generation. As Catherine rejoined her father for their return journey to the Harrington ranch, Thomas stood in the dusty street of Millbrook, wrestling with emotions he had never expected to feel. The investigation into his shooting had stalled, but meeting Catherine Harrington had opened an entirely new chapter in the ongoing saga between their families. Whether that chapter would lead to peace, or even greater conflict, remained to be seen. The weeks following Thomas's encounter with Catherine Harrington passed with agonizing slowness, each day bringing fresh torment as he found himself unable to banish thoughts of Samuel Harrington's daughter from his mind. The autumn roundup demanded his complete attention, but Thomas caught himself staring across the disputed boundary toward Harrington land, wondering what Catherine was doing and whether she had given any thought to their unexpected meeting in Millbrook. The investigation into his shooting had reached a frustrating dead end, with no new leads emerging despite Jake Patterson's continued efforts to uncover the truth. The mysterious gunman seemed to have vanished into the vast wilderness of the Wyoming territory, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense of paranoia that poisoned every interaction Thomas had with his ranch hands and neighbors. It was during this period of uncertainty that Thomas made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew about the deep-rooted hatred between the Whitfield and Harrington families. Unable to concentrate on his work and driven by an inexplicable need to see Catherine again, he began riding to the neutral territory near Devil's Canyon, the same area where he had been shot months earlier. The irony of returning to the scene of his near murder was not lost on Thomas, but something compelled him to visit the rocky outcropping where his attacker had hidden. Perhaps he hoped to discover some clue that had been overlooked during the initial investigation, or maybe he simply needed to confront the demons that haunted him from that terrible day. What he found instead was Catherine Harrington, sitting alone on a boulder overlooking the canyon. The sight of her silhouetted against the dramatic landscape took Thomas's breath away, and for a moment he wondered if the bullet wound had affected his mind more seriously than anyone had realized. Catherine appeared to be sketching the scenery in a leather-bound book, her concentration so complete that she didn't notice his approach until his horse's hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. The surprise on Catherine's face quickly gave way to something that might have been relief, as though she had been hoping for exactly this encounter while telling herself it was impossible. The awkwardness of their first meeting in Millbrook had been replaced by something deeper and more complicated, a recognition that they were both struggling with feelings that defied everything they had been taught about their family's relationship. Their conversation began cautiously, with both parties maintaining the careful distance that their family names demanded. But as the afternoon wore on, the artificial barriers began to crumble, replaced by a genuine connection that surprised them both with its intensity. Catherine spoke about her education back east, her love of literature and art, and her frustration with the limited role that frontier society expected women to play. Thomas found himself sharing details about his own life that he had never discussed with anyone, including his fears about the investigation into his shooting and his growing doubts about the people he had trusted for years. Catherine listened with a compassion that seemed to heal wounds that Thomas hadn't even realized were still bleeding, offering insights that came from a perspective he had never considered. The discovery that Catherine had been visiting Devil's Canyon regularly, drawn by its dramatic beauty and the solitude it offered, created an unspoken understanding between them. Both were seeking something in this remote location, though neither was entirely certain what they hoped to find. The fact that Thomas had been shot near this very spot added a layer of danger and significance to their clandestine meetings. As the sun began to set over the canyon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Thomas and Catherine both realized that something fundamental had changed between them. What had begun as curiosity about their family's enemy had evolved into something far more dangerous and potentially destructive. They were falling in love, despite everything that stood against them. The ride back to their respective ranches was made in silence, each lost in thoughts about the implications of what was happening between them. Thomas knew that his feelings for Catherine represented a betrayal of everything his family had fought for over the past 2 decades. Yet he also understood that these emotions were more powerful than any hatred he had ever experienced. Catherine faced an even more complicated situation, knowing that her father's reaction to her friendship with Thomas Whitfield would be explosive and potentially violent. Samuel Harrington had raised her to believe that the Whitfield family represented everything evil about the frontier mentality, yet she had discovered in Thomas a man of honor, intelligence, and surprising gentleness. The secret meetings at Devil's Canyon continued throughout the remainder of autumn, with both Thomas and Catherine taking enormous risks to spend time together in the remote location. They shared stories, dreams, and fears that created bonds stronger than anything either had experienced before. Yet lurking beneath their growing love was the constant awareness that their relationship was built on a foundation of deception and family betrayal. Winter's harsh grip on the Wyoming territory forced Thomas and Catherine to suspend their secret meetings at Devil's Canyon, but the separation only intensified the emotions that had been building between them throughout the autumn months. Thomas found himself counting the days until spring would allow them to resume their clandestine encounters, while Catherine struggled to maintain normal interactions with her father, while her heart belonged to his greatest enemy. The investigation into Thomas's shooting had grown completely cold during the winter months, with no new evidence emerging despite Jake Patterson's continued efforts to identify the mysterious gunman. The lack of progress had begun to wear on Thomas in ways that went beyond mere frustration, creating a constant undercurrent of tension that affected every aspect of his daily life on the ranch. Samuel Harrington had noticed changes in his daughter's behavior throughout the winter, though he attributed her distraction and occasional melancholy to the isolation that affected everyone during the harsh frontier winters. Catherine had become adept at hiding her true feelings, but the constant deception was taking a toll on her spirit that manifested in subtle ways her father was beginning to notice. As the first signs of spring appeared across the territory in March of 1874, Thomas made a decision that would have consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. Unable to bear the separation any longer, he wrote a letter to Catherine proposing that they meet at Devil's Canyon to discuss their future together. The letter was delivered through a complex chain of intermediaries designed to protect both their identities. Catherine's response came within a week, agreeing to the meeting but expressing concerns about the risks they were taking and the impossibility of their situation. Her words revealed the depth of her feelings, while acknowledging the practical obstacles that stood in the way of any future together. The letter ended with a declaration of love that sent Thomas's heart soaring, despite the challenges they faced. The reunion at Devil's Canyon was charged with emotions that had been suppressed throughout the long winter months. Both Thomas and Catherine had spent countless hours thinking about their relationship and its implications, Yet seeing each other again made all rational considerations seem insignificant compared to the power of their connection. They fell into each other's arms with a passion that had been building for months. Their conversation that day centered on the impossibility of their situation and the limited options available to them. Catherine spoke about the possibility of leaving the territory entirely, starting a new life somewhere their family names would carry no weight. Thomas listened to her plans with growing excitement, but also with the realistic understanding that abandoning his ranch would mean destroying everything his family had built over 3 generations. As they discussed their options, Thomas made a proposal that shocked Catherine with its audacity and potential for disaster. Rather than running away from their families and their past, he suggested that they confront the situation directly by announcing their engagement and demanding that both families accept their relationship. The plan was dangerous beyond measure, but it offered the possibility of a future together without the constant deception that was poisoning their love. Catherine's initial reaction was one of terror at the thought of her father's response to such news. Samuel Harrington's hatred for the Whitfield family was legendary throughout the territory, and she knew that learning about her relationship with Thomas could drive him to violence that would destroy any chance of reconciliation. Yet she also understood that continuing their secret relationship indefinitely was impossible. The discussion continued for hours as they weighed the risks and potential benefits of Thomas's proposal. Both understood that announcing their engagement would likely result in one or both of their families disowning them completely. Yet they also recognized that their love had grown beyond the point where they could simply walk away from each other and resume their previous lives. As the sun began to set over Devil's Canyon, Thomas and Catherine made a decision that would change the course of both their lives forever. They would return to their respective families and prepare the groundwork for announcing their engagement, despite the catastrophic consequences that were certain to follow. The decision required enormous courage from both of them, but they had reached the point where love was more important than family loyalty. The ride back to their ranches that evening was filled with both excitement and dread as they contemplated the battles that lay ahead. Thomas knew that his announcement would shock and anger many of his ranch hands, particularly those who had lost friends and family members in conflicts with the Harrington clan. Catherine faced an even more daunting prospect in confronting her father with news that would shatter his fundamental beliefs about family loyalty and honor. Yet beneath their fears lay a determination that had been forged through months of secret meetings and growing love. They had discovered in each other something worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect and nurture. The coming confrontation with their families would test that love in ways they could barely imagine, but they were prepared to face whatever consequences their decision might bring. The morning of April 15, 1874, dawned clear and crisp across the Wyoming territory, but Thomas Whitfield's hands trembled as he prepared for the most important and dangerous conversation of his life. He had spent 3 sleepless nights rehearsing the words he would use to tell his ranch hands and closest friends about his relationship with Catherine Harrington, knowing that their reactions would range from shock to outright betrayal. Jake Patterson was the first person Thomas chose to confide in, calling his most trusted foreman into the study where so many crucial decisions had been made over the years. The older man's weathered face went through a series of expressions as Thomas revealed the truth about his secret meetings with Samuel Harrington's daughter, beginning with disbelief and progressing through anger to something approaching understanding. The revelation that Thomas had been meeting secretly with a member of the Harrington family for months hit Jake like a physical blow, particularly given the ongoing investigation into the shooting that had nearly cost Thomas his life. The foreman's first reaction was to question whether Catherine might have been involved in gathering information for her father, possibly even participating in the plot to assassinate Thomas. Thomas's passionate defense of Catherine's character and his detailed account of their relationship gradually convinced Jake that the young woman's feelings were genuine, but the foreman remained deeply concerned about the practical implications of the situation. The announcement of an engagement between a Whitfield and a Harrington would send shockwaves throughout the territory, potentially triggering violence that could destroy both families. The conversation with Jake lasted for over 2 hours, during which Thomas revealed not only his love for Catherine, but also his growing conviction that the feud between their families had become a destructive force that was poisoning the entire territory. He spoke about his vision of a future where their marriage could serve as a bridge between the 2 clans, ending decades of hostility and creating opportunities for cooperation rather than conflict. Meanwhile, 15 miles away on the Harrington ranch, Catherine was facing an even more daunting challenge as she prepared to reveal her relationship with Thomas to her father. Samuel Harrington was a man whose hatred for the Whitfield family had become the defining characteristic of his personality, shaping every business decision and personal relationship he had maintained for over 2 decades. Catherine chose to approach her father during his morning routine of reviewing ranch operations in his office, hoping that the familiar surroundings might help temper his reaction to her shocking news. Samuel looked up from his ledgers with the affectionate smile he reserved exclusively for his daughter, completely unprepared for the revelation that was about to shatter his world. The words came out in a rush as Catherine told her father about meeting Thomas in Millbrook, their subsequent encounters at Devil's Canyon, and the deep love that had developed between them. Samuel's expression changed from confusion to horror to rage as he processed the information, his face turning an alarming shade of red as the full implications of her confession became clear. The explosion that followed was everything Catherine had feared and worse. Samuel Harrington's fury was volcanic in its intensity, with accusations of betrayal, stupidity, and treason pouring from his lips in a torrent of wounded pride and paternal outrage. He demanded to know how his own daughter could have been so thoroughly deceived by the family that had been their sworn enemies for an entire generation. Catherine stood her ground throughout her father's tirade, responding to his accusations with calm dignity, while insisting that Thomas was nothing like the monster she had been taught to fear. Her defense of the man her father considered his greatest enemy only served to fuel Samuel's rage, convincing him that his daughter had been completely brainwashed by Whitfield manipulation and lies. The confrontation reached its climax when Samuel issued an ultimatum that would haunt both families for months to come. Catherine could choose between her loyalty to the Harrington name and her misguided infatuation with Thomas Whitfield, but she could not have both. If she insisted on pursuing this relationship, she would be dead to her father and banned from ever setting foot on Harrington land again. Catherine's response surprised Samuel with its strength and determination. Rather than backing down in the face of his threats, she calmly informed her father that she had already made her choice. Her love for Thomas was stronger than her fear of Samuel's anger, and she would not abandon the man who had brought joy and purpose into her life simply to maintain family harmony. The conversation ended with Samuel storming from the room, leaving Catherine alone with the realization that she had effectively orphaned herself for the sake of love. Yet despite the pain of her father's rejection, she felt a sense of liberation that came from finally being able to live according to her own values, rather than the hatred and prejudice that had defined her family for so long. News of the brewing scandal began to spread throughout the territory, with the speed of a prairie fire, carried by ranch hands, shopkeepers, and travelers, who witnessed the aftermath of the explosive confrontations on both ranches. The idea that a Whitfield and a Harrington might actually marry seemed so outrageous that many people initially dismissed it as an elaborate joke or misunderstanding. The announcement of Thomas Whitfield's engagement to Catherine Harrington sent shockwaves throughout Wyoming territory that reverberated far beyond the immediate families involved. Within days of the revelation, every saloon, general store, and ranch house for 100 miles was buzzing with speculation about the impossible romance that had somehow blossomed between the children of sworn enemies. Samuel Harrington's reaction to his daughter's betrayal had evolved from explosive rage to cold calculation, as he considered his options for preventing what he saw as the ultimate humiliation of his family name. The old rancher had built his empire through ruthless determination and strategic thinking, and he was not prepared to allow his life's work to be destroyed by what he considered his daughter's temporary insanity. Meanwhile, Thomas faced his own challenges as several of his most loyal ranch hands struggled to accept their boss's relationship with a member of the family they had been taught to despise. 3 of his longest-serving employees had already quit in protest, unable to reconcile their loyalty to Thomas with their hatred for everything the Harrington name represented. Jake Patterson remained at Thomas's side throughout the crisis, though the foreman's concerns about the wisdom of the marriage continued to grow with each passing day. The older man had witnessed firsthand the violence that the feud between the families had generated over the years, and he feared that the wedding would provide a catalyst for bloodshed that could engulf the entire territory. Catherine had taken refuge at a boarding house in Millbrook after her father's ultimatum, refusing to abandon her engagement despite the personal cost of her decision. The young woman's courage in the face of overwhelming opposition had earned her both admirers and detractors throughout the community, with opinions sharply divided about whether she was a romantic heroine or a foolish girl who had been manipulated by her family's enemy. The practical arrangements for the wedding presented enormous challenges, beginning with the fundamental question of where the ceremony could take place. No church in the territory was willing to host an event that threatened to trigger violence between two of the most powerful families in the region. Eventually, Thomas and Catherine decided to hold the wedding at the courthouse in Millbrook, with only a handful of witnesses present. Finding an officiant proved equally difficult, as most of the clergy in the area were reluctant to participate in what many considered a dangerous publicity stunt. Eventually, Judge Harrison Matthews agreed to perform the ceremony, though he insisted on hiring additional security for the courthouse on the day of the wedding. The elderly judge had presided over numerous disputes between the Whitfield and Harrington families over the years, and he harbored hopes that this marriage might finally bring peace to the territory. As the wedding date of May 20th approached, tensions throughout the region continued to escalate. Samuel Harrington had made it clear that he would not attend the ceremony and had forbidden any of his ranch hands from participating in what he called a mockery of everything the family stood for. Several of Catherine's childhood friends had also distanced themselves from her, unwilling to risk Samuel's wrath by supporting her decision. Thomas spent the days leading up to the wedding, trying to maintain normal operations on his ranch, while dealing with the constant stress of death threats and hostile confrontations with neighbors who viewed his engagement as a betrayal of everything the frontier community represented. The investigation into his shooting had been completely overshadowed by the wedding controversy, but the mystery of his attacker's identity remained unsolved. Catherine used her time in Millbrook to prepare for the wedding and to write letters to friends and family members who might be willing to reconcile with her after the ceremony. Her correspondence revealed both her determination to proceed with the marriage and her deep sadness at the cost her decision had extracted from her relationships with people she loved. The dress Catherine chose for her wedding was simple but elegant, purchased with money she had saved from her small inheritance from her deceased mother. The absence of family heirlooms or ceremonial items that would normally be passed down through generations of Harrington women served as a constant reminder of the price she was paying for her choice to marry outside her family's expectations. Thomas's wedding preparations were equally somber, as he struggled to find appropriate attire while dealing with the practical challenges of running his ranch with a severely reduced workforce. Several of his former employees had not only quit, but had also actively encouraged others to abandon their posts, leaving Thomas short-handed during one of the busiest periods of the ranching year. The guest list for the wedding was pathetically small, consisting primarily of Jake Patterson, Judge Matthews, a few courthouse employees who would serve as witnesses, and perhaps 2 or 3 friends who were brave enough to risk the social consequences of attending. The absence of family members from both sides cast a shadow over what should have been the happiest day of their lives. As the wedding day approached, both Thomas and Catherine began to receive increasingly specific threats about what would happen if they proceeded with the ceremony. Anonymous letters warned of violence that would make the previous conflicts between their families seem insignificant by comparison. Yet despite the danger and the opposition they faced, both remained determined to proceed with their plans. The morning of May 20th, 1874, arrived with an ominous stillness that seemed to blanket the entire Wyoming territory, as though nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the unprecedented event about to unfold. Thomas Whitfield stood before the mirror in his hotel room, adjusting his necktie with hands that trembled despite his determination to appear confident. Today he would marry Catherine Harrington, an act that would either heal the wounds between their families or trigger violence that could destroy everything both clans had built. The courthouse in Millbrook had been transformed into an unlikely wedding venue, with Judge Harrison Matthews overseeing security arrangements that included armed guards positioned at every entrance. The elderly judge understood the historical significance of this ceremony and was determined that it would proceed without the bloodshed that many predicted would accompany any union between the warring families. Catherine arrived at the courthouse wearing her simple white dress, her face pale but resolute as she prepared to take the most important step of her life. The absence of her father and other family members created a void that seemed to echo through the nearly empty building, but she drew strength from the knowledge that she was finally taking control of her own destiny. Thomas waited at the altar with Jake Patterson serving as his best man, both men scanning the small crowd of witnesses for any signs of trouble. The tension in the room was palpable, with everyone present understanding that they were participating in an event that would be remembered throughout the territory for generations to come. Judge Matthews began the ceremony with words about love conquering hatred and the possibility of redemption through forgiveness, themes that seemed particularly relevant given the circumstances surrounding this unusual wedding. His voice carried clearly through the courthouse as he spoke about the courage required to choose love over family loyalty, and the hope that this marriage might serve as a bridge between two communities that had been divided for far too long. As the ceremony progressed through the traditional vows, both Thomas and Catherine felt the weight of history pressing down upon them. They were not merely exchanging personal promises of love and devotion, but were also making a statement about the possibility of peace in a region that had known primarily conflict and suspicion. Their words carried implications that extended far beyond their individual relationship. The moment arrived for Judge Matthews to ask if anyone present knew of any reason why Thomas and Catherine should not be joined in marriage. The question hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity, with everyone in the courthouse expecting some dramatic interruption that would prevent the ceremony from reaching its conclusion. It was then that Catherine Harrington, standing at the altar in her white wedding dress, turned to face the small crowd of witnesses and made an announcement that would change everything anyone thought they knew about the shooting that had nearly killed Thomas 8 months earlier. Her voice was steady and clear as she spoke words that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. "Before I marry this man," Catherine declared, her green eyes blazing with determination, "there is something everyone in this territory needs to know about what really happened the day Thomas was shot at Devil's Canyon. The man who pulled that trigger, the man who tried to murder my husband-to-be, was not some mysterious stranger or hired gunman. The shooter was my own father, Samuel Harrington." The courthouse erupted into chaos as the implications of Catherine's revelation sank in. Jake Patterson's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, while Judge Matthews called for order among the stunned witnesses. Thomas stood frozen at the altar, his mind struggling to process the information that his bride-to-be had just revealed about her own father's attempt to murder him. Catherine continued speaking through the commotion, her voice growing stronger as she finally revealed the truth she had been carrying for months. She had discovered her father's guilt accidentally, finding the rifle he had used hidden in their barn along with clothing that still carried the scent of gunpowder from that terrible day. The knowledge had tormented her throughout their courtship, but she had been unable to find the courage to reveal the truth until this moment. The young woman's confession explained so much about the investigation that had mystified Thomas and Jake for months. Samuel Harrington's intimate knowledge of Thomas's routines, his access to the disputed territory, and his motivation for wanting his enemy dead had made him the perfect assassin. The fact that the shot had not been fatal was likely due to his age and the distance involved rather than any mercy on his part. Thomas felt a complex mixture of emotions as he absorbed the reality of what Catherine had revealed. The relief of finally knowing his attacker's identity was overshadowed by the horror of realizing that his bride's own father had tried to kill him. The implications for their marriage and any hope of family reconciliation were devastating beyond measure. Catherine's revelation also cast her decision to marry Thomas in an entirely new light. She was not simply choosing love over family loyalty, but was actively betraying her father to protect the man he had tried to murder. Her courage in speaking the truth at the altar demonstrated a moral strength that impressed even those who opposed the marriage. Judge Matthews eventually restored order to the courthouse and asked Catherine if she was certain about her accusations against her father. Her affirmative response, delivered with unwavering conviction, left no doubt about the truth of her claims. The wedding ceremony had become something far more significant than a simple exchange of vows between two people in love. The immediate aftermath of Catherine's shocking revelation at the altar created a maelstrom of activity that transformed the courthouse from a wedding venue into the center of a criminal investigation. Judge Matthews immediately suspended the ceremony and called for the territorial marshal, while Jake Patterson dispatched riders to secure the Harrington ranch before Samuel could escape or destroy evidence related to the shooting. Thomas stood in stunned silence as the reality of his situation sank in. The woman he loved had just revealed that her own father had attempted to murder him, a betrayal that cut deeper than the bullet that had torn through his shoulder 8 months earlier. Yet as he looked into Catherine's tear-filled eyes, he saw not treachery but the ultimate expression of love and moral courage. Catherine's decision to reveal her father's crime at the altar had been carefully calculated to ensure maximum impact and legal protection. By making the accusation in front of Judge Matthews and multiple witnesses, she had created an official record that would be difficult for her father to refute or for corrupt officials to suppress. Her timing also demonstrated that her loyalty now belonged entirely to Thomas, rather than to the family that had raised her. Within hours of Catherine's announcement, Marshal Davis Wade had assembled a posse to arrest Samuel Harrington on charges of attempted murder. The marshal was a fair but tough lawman, who had been trying to maintain peace in the territory for over a decade, often finding himself caught between the conflicting interests of powerful ranching families like the Whitfields and Harringtons. The confrontation at the Harrington Ranch was swift but tense, with Samuel initially denying any involvement in the shooting, before being presented with evidence that Catherine had secretly gathered over the months following her discovery of his guilt. The rifle she had found, along with testimony from ranch hands who had noticed their boss's absence on the day of the shooting, created a compelling case for prosecution. Samuel Harrington's arrest sent shockwaves throughout the territory that rivaled the impact of the wedding announcement itself. The revelation that one of the most respected ranchers in Wyoming had attempted murder out of family pride shattered the image many people had maintained about the nature of the feud between the two families. What many had seen as honorable competition between equals was revealed to be something far more sinister. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the political connections Samuel had cultivated over his decades as a successful rancher. Several influential citizens attempted to intervene on his behalf, arguing that the shooting had been justified as defense of family honor. These efforts were ultimately unsuccessful due to the overwhelming evidence against him and the public nature of Catherine's accusations. Catherine's role in her father's prosecution created a moral dilemma that divided public opinion throughout the territory. Some viewed her as a heroic figure who had chosen justice over family loyalty, while others saw her as a treacherous daughter who had betrayed her own blood for the sake of a romantic obsession. The debate reflected deeper questions about the nature of family obligation and moral responsibility. Thomas found himself in the unprecedented position of being both the victim of an attempted murder and the son-in-law of the perpetrator. The legal system struggled to address the complications this created, particularly regarding Catherine's testimony against her father and her inheritance rights to Harrington property. The case established precedents that would influence territorial law for years to come. The wedding ceremony was finally completed 3 weeks after Catherine's revelation, in a much smaller and more subdued affair than originally planned. Judge Matthews performed the service in his private chambers, with only Jake Patterson and the court clerk serving as witnesses. The bride and groom exchanged vows under circumstances that were far different from anything they had originally envisioned. Samuel Harrington was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison, a relatively light punishment that reflected both his advanced age and the complex family dynamics involved in the case. The sentence satisfied neither those who called for harsher punishment nor those who believed he should have been acquitted entirely, but it represented a compromise that allowed the community to begin healing. The Harrington Ranch faced an uncertain future following Samuel's conviction and imprisonment. Catherine, as his only heir, found herself in control of vast holdings that she had no experience managing independently. The irony that a Whitfield wife now controlled half the disputed territory was not lost on anyone involved in the decades-long feud. Thomas and Catherine's marriage began under a cloud of suspicion and controversy that would take years to overcome. Many people in the territory continued to view their union with skepticism, questioning whether genuine love could survive the traumatic circumstances of its origin. The couple faced social isolation and business challenges that tested their commitment to each other and their shared vision of peace. The resolution of the shooting case finally brought closure to a mystery that had haunted Thomas for months, but it also opened new questions about trust, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption in relationships damaged by violence and betrayal. The truth had set them free, but freedom came with a price that would influence the rest of their lives together. The summer of 1874 brought unprecedented changes to the Wyoming territory, as Thomas and Catherine Whitfield worked to merge their ranching operations and heal the wounds created by decades of family conflict. The newlyweds faced enormous challenges in combining properties that had been deliberately kept separate by their feuding families, while also dealing with the social ostracism that followed their controversial marriage. Catherine's inheritance of the Harrington Ranch following her father's imprisonment created complex legal and practical problems that required months to resolve. Many of Samuel's former employees refused to work for a Whitfield, while others struggled to accept orders from a woman who had betrayed their former boss. The transition period was marked by resignations, conflicts, and financial losses that threatened the viability of the combined operation. Thomas demonstrated remarkable patience and wisdom in dealing with the former Harrington hands, offering employment to anyone willing to put aside old grievances and work toward a common goal. His approach emphasized practical benefits rather than emotional appeals, showing how cooperation between the ranches could improve working conditions and increase profits for everyone involved. The investigation into Samuel Harrington's motives for the shooting revealed a complex web of financial pressures and personal obsessions that had driven the old rancher to attempt murder. Debts accumulated through poor investments and market fluctuations had threatened his empire, making the elimination of his primary competitor seem like a viable solution to his problems. The revelation helped explain why the feud had escalated so dramatically in recent years. Catherine's courage in exposing her father's crime had earned her respect among many people in the territory, but it had also created lasting enmity with others who viewed family loyalty as sacred regardless of circumstances. The polarized reactions to her decision reflected broader cultural tensions about the role of women, the nature of justice, and the obligations of family members to protect each other from legal consequences. The combined Whitfield-Harrington Ranch became one of the largest operations in the territory, controlling vast stretches of prime grazing land that had previously been divided by arbitrary boundaries created through decades of conflict. The merger allowed for more efficient use of resources and eliminated the wasteful duplication of facilities that had characterized the previous arrangement. Thomas and Catherine's marriage gradually proved its authenticity to skeptics who had initially dismissed it as a political arrangement or temporary infatuation. Their obvious devotion to each other, combined with their shared commitment to building something positive from the ashes of their family's destruction, eventually won over many of their harshest critics. Time demonstrated that their love could withstand the pressures that had destroyed so many other relationships. The couple's first child was born in the spring of 1875, a daughter they named Hope as a symbol of their belief in the possibility of redemption and new beginnings. The baby represented the first generation to be born free from the hatred that had defined their grandparents' relationship, offering the promise of a future where family names would not determine personal destiny. Samuel Harrington's time in prison had a profound effect on the old rancher, forcing him to confront the consequences of his actions and the hatred that had consumed his life for so many years. Letters he wrote to Catherine from prison revealed a gradual softening of his attitudes and genuine remorse for the pain he had caused, though full reconciliation remained complicated by pride and wounded feelings on both sides. The territorial government recognized the Whitfield Ranch's success in ending one of the region's most destructive feuds by awarding Thomas and Catherine a contract to supply beef to military posts throughout Wyoming. The arrangement provided financial stability and official recognition of their efforts to bring peace to a previously troubled area. Jake Patterson emerged as a crucial figure in the ranch's success, serving as a bridge between old employees and new management while providing the stability needed during the transition period. His loyalty to Thomas and growing respect for Catherine helped convince other workers that the merger could benefit everyone involved rather than simply enriching the owners. The story of Thomas and Catherine's romance became legendary throughout the territory, inspiring other couples to challenge family expectations and social conventions in pursuit of love. Their example demonstrated that even the deepest hatreds could be overcome through courage, honesty, and determination to build something better than what previous generations had created. The success of the combined ranch operation proved that cooperation could achieve results that competition had never produced. Increased efficiency, reduced waste, and shared resources allowed the Whitfields to prosper in ways that would have been impossible under the previous system of rivalry and conflict. Their example influenced other ranching families to reconsider their own feuds and competitive relationships. By the end of 1875, Thomas and Catherine had established themselves as leaders in the territorial community, hosting social events that brought together people from across the region and promoting policies that encouraged cooperation rather than conflict. Their home became a symbol of the possibility for redemption and new beginnings in a harsh frontier environment, where such opportunities were rare and precious. The legacy they built together represented more than just personal happiness or business success. It demonstrated the transformative power of love to overcome hatred, forgiveness to heal wounds, and courage to challenge systems that perpetuated injustice. Their story became part of the folklore of the American West, inspiring future generations to believe in the possibility of peace even in the most unlikely circumstances. The end.